Yes, sir. Oh.
Good morning. I'll speak a little louder. Feel free to tell if I can't follow you. Glad everyone came out to Bible class this morning. Bill, Deem, and his wife and family are with us this morning. Bill was raised in Parkersburg area. He attended the Canham Avenue congregation. After graduating from South Parkersburg High School, Bill attended Ohio Valley College, earning a bachelor's degree in Bible. He married Hope West of Vienna and relocated to Knoxville, Tennessee, where he attended the East Tennessee School of Preaching. He began preaching at the Mount Zion Church of Christ in Walker, West Virginia, followed by the Pike Church of Christ in Pike, West Virginia, before beginning his studies at East Tennessee School of Preaching. Following his completion of those studies, he worked with congregations in Athens, Tennessee, Rockport, West Virginia, and Mineral Wells, West Virginia, and arriving at his current work at the Henderson Church of Christ in Henderson, West Virginia in 2009. Of course, Bill has his wife, his daughter, Hannah, and we'll call Ben. This is Ben here, but I'll say Ben because that's what he's doing by Nathan Nerve Spears of the high school. So please make your effort to, if you haven't already introduced yourself, please. I'll turn things over to you.
All right. Thank you, Tom. At this point, I understand that Brother David often words prayer, so I'm going to ask him if he would please lead us in a word of prayer.
Our Father, we're thankful for this very beautiful morning and for the opportunity we now have to study together for your word. We pray this morning that you will be with Bill and the rest of our class. Each of us may listen, we can better understand your word. We pray for the ones who couldn't make it out this morning, and for Joanne, we pray that you will help them feel better. If it is your will, and as soon come back and be with us. We pray now to be with us in our study together. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, so I understand that you've been studying Zechariah. So we're in Zechariah chapter 6 this morning. And I'll be honest, Zechariah is a book that I've probably never really taught much out of, other than quoting here and there for speaking about Jesus, connecting those some of the prophecies to Jesus and things like that. But we're going to be in Zechariah chapter 6, so let's go ahead and turn our Bibles there. Now, it's divided into two main parts, as we will see. First of all, we have a vision that Zechariah receives about 4 chariots and horses. And then we have Joshua, the high priest, showing up again. So the first 8 verses deal with the vision. We're going to start with that. And then we will maybe make it to the second section. There's a lot of information in both Zechariah 6, first half, and the second half. So let's read the first 8 verses. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. It says, again, make sure I'm in the right book here. Again, I lifted my eyes and saw, and behold, 4 chariots came out from between 2 mountains, and the mountains were mountains of bronze. The first chariot had red horses, the second black horses, the third white horses, and the fourth chariot dappled horses, all of them strong. Then I answered and said to the angel who talked with me, "What are these, my Lord?" And the angel answered and said to me, "These are going out to the 4 winds of heaven after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth. The chariot with the black horses goes towards the north country. The white ones go after them, and the dappled ones go toward the south country." When the strong horses came out, they were impatient to go and patrol the earth. And he said, "Go, patrol the earth." So they patrolled the earth. Then he cried to me, "Behold, those who go toward the north country have set my spirit at rest in the north country." All right, so as we look at this, there's some things that we want to take a look at. First of all, do you see any parallels with anything else, either in Zechariah or maybe another book in the Bible with this vision? Revelation, or we have the first vision. That's right. So you got first vision and Revelation. Both of those are paralleling this to a large degree, especially the first vision of Zechariah. The four horsemen of the apocalypse is probably what we are going to think of. When I read this, right away, that was the first thing that came to my mind. Now, there's some differences between this and both of those visions in Zechariah 1 and Revelation with the four horsemen of the apocalypse. As we're looking at the horses, they're all different colors. And so most of the time we're going to assume that those horses, those colors, are going to be symbolic of something. Now, the Bible does not play tricks on us. So we are able to go to, if it doesn't explain something in one place, in the Bible's its best commentary. We have a lot of commentaries that we use. Sometimes they're good, and sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're wrong, but that's good to have them. But the Bible itself will explain itself. We just have to be patient and know where to look. So it doesn't give us a lot of information about these horses right off. And what I do love about Zechariah, we'll talk about that here in a second more. What I do love about Zechariah, if he doesn't understand something in a vision, what does he do? He asks about it. What is this? What does this mean? And he gets an explanation. Now, interesting enough, as we're reading Zechariah chapter 6, he asks about these things, and the angel gives him an explanation, but he doesn't explain everything. And we'll talk about that here in a minute as well. But if we were to look at the book of Revelation and compare what we see there with that parallel with the four horsemen of the apocalypse with this vision, well, of course, we have the red horse. So what's the red horses represent in Revelation? They represent war. The red horse represents war. Then you have the white horse. Now, in the book of Revelation, you have two different white horses. You have the white horse that Jesus rides when he has the sword that is coming out of his mouth, and he has the name that only he himself knows, that sort of thing. But you also have another white horse, and they're not the same. So the white horse of the four horses is usually considered someone who goes out to conquer. So the red and white horses are very similar to one another. The black horse is going to deal with judgment, some other things going on there, and then there is a difference between the dappled horses and the last horse. In Zechariah, you have dappled horses in chapter 6. In chapter 1, they're called sorreled horses. I don't believe that there's any difference there, just a different word. But in the Revelation, what do you have? You have the pale rider. So there is a difference there. And of course, the pale rider represents death. Dappled rider, probably because it's all of the same colors. I was reading in one commentary, because it's dappled colors throwing in the red and the white and the black. It may mean it parallels with all of the other judgments and all of the other horses. I'm not sure about that, but that's what a couple of different commentators had mentioned. We'll keep on talking about the horses here for a couple of minutes. It says that they were all strong. Now, one translation that I was reading made it sound like only the dappled horses were strong, but most of the translations I read and studied made it seem like all of the horses. English Standard Version makes it seem like all of the horses were strong. They were impatient. They were ready to go and do the thing that they needed to do. So he asks about what these things are. What is this? He wants to understand. So let's look at the explanation that the angel gives. He says, starting in verse 4, after he says, "Then I answered and said to the angel and talked with me, what are these, my Lord? And the angel answered and said to me, these are going out to the four winds of heaven, after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth." I'll stop there for a second. The Hebrew and the Greek languages do something that we don't have in English. There may be some other languages that do it. I'm not 100% sure, but I know the Hebrew and the Greek do it, and that is that they use the same word for breath or wind or spirit. And so if you're reading the New American Standard, maybe in another translation, it's going to say when the angel gives him the explanation, he's going to say these are the four spirits sent from God, something like that. The English Standard Version says these are the winds, or they're going to go out to the four winds of the earth. So I want to talk about that for a second. We see this constantly throughout the Bible when it comes to breath, wind, and spirit. For example, if you were to go back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, it says that that God breathed into man the breath of life. That same word there, that breathed into man the breath of life, which obviously is what we need to have to live. You can't live without air, but you also can't live without what else? Your spirit. The Bible confirms that in the book of James when it says that the body without the spirit is dead. So there's an interesting play on words with breath. And that's not saying that our breath is our spirit. It's not what it's saying at all. But there is an interesting play on words that is used a little bit here in Zechariah. Another place that we can see that pretty clearly is in John chapter 3 when Jesus is speaking with Nicodemus. And he talks about the wind, and it comes and goes, and you don't know where it's coming, you don't know where it's going to. And he says the same way with the Spirit. So if we were reading the Greek, we would see that Jesus is using a play on words there. And we see a play on words here. If we were reading the Hebrew, we'd see a play on words here as well. And as we get down through there, we'll talk a little bit more about that probably. But he uses the number 4. All right, so the number 4. Typically, when you're looking at prophetic literature, especially apocalyptic literature, numbers are going to mean a great deal. All right, so, first of all, when we think of a complete or a perfect number in Hebrew numerology, what do we typically think of? 7, right? But there are other ones that have similar meanings. 4 is one of them. 12 is another. Now, I want you to think about this. You look at the Bible, and you will see these numbers popping up. 10 is another one, as well as 40. And then you start multiplying things here and there. 10 times 4 is 40. You got Moses on the mountain for 40 days. You've got Elijah on the mountain for 40 days. You've got Jesus. He's fasting in the wilderness for 40 days. So you have the number 40. That's 10 times 4. So there's some things going on there. You have 12. Well, we've got a couple of pretty heavy instances of 12 in the Bible. You have 12 tribes of Israel, 12 sons of Jacob. And of course, you have the 12 apostles. So 12 is an important number. And of course, 7. Now, I want you to think about that also when we think about these things. In nature, we also see this. How many days of the week do we have? We have 7. And of course, where does that come from? Well, it comes from God. We have 7 days of the week that comes from God. So a complete week would be 7 days. So that's where that idea comes from. What about 4? Now, this isn't the way it is all over the earth, because there are some places that aren't like our area, but most places do have them. We have 4 seasons. That shows that, from that angle, you have all 4 seasons. That shows a complete year. It's finished. In the Bible itself, you have 4 a couple of different times. You have 4 Gospels. Now, you could go with that a couple of different ways, because in the Old Testament, God says to establish everything by how many witnesses? 2 or 3. But when it comes to the life of Christ, how many do we have? 4 eyewitness accounts. That gives us a complete picture of the life of Jesus. Now, when you're looking at that, when you say a complete picture of the life of Jesus, it's not going to record everything. You don't need to. You don't have to have everything recorded to have a complete picture of somebody's life. You don't need to know everything about someone to know someone. Remember what John said, that Jesus did so many things while he was here on the earth that if you tried to record all of it or write it down, there wouldn't be enough books in the world to contain it. So we don't know everything that happened. And in fact, you go back to the beginning of the gospel, you have Matthew and Luke record Jesus' birth. Mark and John do not. We have in the Gospels after that, we get to Jesus where he's about 2 or 3, just highlights. You don't have everything that was going on in his life. You then skip from that point until he's about 12, when he's at the temple. And of course, he stayed behind while the caravan went back home, and then they had to come and look for him. And then after that, you don't see anything until he's about 30 years old. But that doesn't mean you don't know him, and that doesn't mean we don't have a clear picture of his life. The 4 Gospels give us a clear indication and understanding of who Jesus is. And so you have that number there, 4. That's complete. You also have in Isaiah and in Revelation, you have the 4 corners of the earth. Now, that does not mean that the Bible is saying that the earth is flat or a cube or anything like that. I guess a square, because a cube has more than 4 corners if I'm looking at it correctly. But you have a square. People will say, well, I see the Bible saying the earth's flat. That's not what it's saying. That's not the thing. What it's saying is 4 corners of the earth means the whole kit and caboodle, the whole thing. So it's a complete number. You'll see that from time to time. So when he says the 4 winds, the 4 spirits, he's talking about a complete and utter judgment. These horses, these chariots being sent out to patrol the earth are related to God's judgment and sovereignty. Something that we're going to see when it comes to the bronze, because as we mentioned, the angel will describe or explain things to Zechariah, but we will notice as we're looking at the explanation here that he doesn't explain everything. But that doesn't mean that we can't figure some things out. And it's open to interpretation because he doesn't explain it, but there are other parallels that we can look at. For example, he doesn't tell us where the red horses go. Remember, he said that the black horses go to the north country and the white horses follow them. The dappled horses go to the south country. Now, it stops with the dappled horses there. But let's think about that for a second. He goes to the north country. Where is the north country? What is that? You know what a lot of people like to say that the north country is today? Anybody have a guess what a lot of people like to say it is? Russia. He's talking about Russia. No, he's not. He's talking about a country that's north of Israel. I guess Russia's north of Israel, but when you're talking to a group of people about getting them encouraged to build the temple, rebuild the temple, they've just come out of 70 years of captivity. They are not going to care whatsoever about a menacing nation 3,000 years from their future. You know, oh, gee, thanks a lot for that information. What do you want me to know? So we need to make sure that when we're reading the Bible, that we're keeping it in context, obviously. I know that you understand this. We keep it in its context of the chapter. Keep it in, of course, the book. What section of time is it in? What period is it in the Old Testament? Is it in the New Testament? The entire thing. You know, we work small and work our way out. Unfortunately, the thing that a lot of times people will do when it comes to biblical interpretation is that they will work from themselves and go back instead of starting with the Bible and moving out towards themselves. But see, you're going to get really confused if you start with yourself and move backwards. That's going to lead to taking things out of context, terribly and really just abusing the text. But if you go from where it is, realize who it's speaking to primarily, then you can work your way out and then apply it to ourselves today. There are applications, but we don't need to force things that the text would never say. So they just come from Persia. Of course, Persia had conquered Babylon, and all kinds of horrible things had happened to many nations, but especially Judah when Babylon took over. And so they're going to the north. If you remember, earlier in the book of Zechariah, we are told that God was angry, but these nations that he used to punish his people went much further than what they should have gone. And so they are going to receive what's due them as well. Because God is sovereign over the nations. He still is, by the way. That has not changed. He is still in control. He is still in power. Jesus is still the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And when we read Revelation, that's the idea that we get. That no matter what happens in this world, governments are going to hate God's people. There's going to be persecution all over the earth. There always has been. We've lived in a very unique area. I used to say we live in a very unique time. It's not a unique time, it's a unique area. Because we know that the 20th century had more people that were killed who claimed the name of Christ and punished and treated and tortured horribly than almost any centuries previous to it. But we've been blessed to live in a place that doesn't persecute us in that regard. We have victory in Christ. God's people have victory, even though they had to go through some difficult things. They needed to remain focused. They needed to persevere. We see that's what we are told to do constantly through the Scriptures. Persevere. You're going to have tribulation in this world. But what does Jesus say? Take courage. For what? I have overcome the world. And so if we're in Christ, we've overcome the world with him. And there's no reason to fear that which the world may say or do when we have God on our side, because as Paul says, if God is for us, who can be against us? We are more than conquerors through him who loved us. And that is a parallel message to what I believe is going on here with Zechariah. And he says that they've gone to the north country and they've set my spirit at ease. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But first I want to talk about these bronze mountains. The angel does not describe the bronze mountains. He doesn't give any explanation of what that is at all. So again, that's open for interpretation. But as we said earlier in the beginning of class, the Bible will be its best commentary. And there are places that it does explain what bronze is when it comes to prophecy, especially what we call apocalyptic literature. By the way, what does the word apocalypse mean? Let's just talk about that for a second. So in our culture, what do we use it for? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Right, the end of time, yeah. Or something horrible. Do you remember a few years ago there was a horrible snowstorm, a blizzard that hit Georgia? People were stuck in their cars on the highway. It must have been absolutely terrifying. The news called it snowcopalypse or something like that. I thought that was kind of interesting. But we use it for that term, the end of the world. There was a movie with Bruce Willis back in the 90s where a meteor was coming and they were trying to stop that from hitting the earth. And it was called Armageddon, but it was about what they would call the apocalypse. And so a lot of folks hear that word and they think, oh, it's talking about the end of times, the end of times. That's not how the Bible uses it. We have to make sure that we are not going to. Could it be talking about the end of times? Sure. But it's not usually. And so in the book of Revelation, we call it Revelation, but if you were reading it in the original language, it would say the apocalypse of John. So the word apocalypse just really means a revealing, which is where we get the term revelation. And Zechariah uses apocalyptic literature here. He has apocalyptic visions. Ezekiel does. Much of his prophecies are in that type of literature. And Daniel, chapter 7 through 12. And there's a few other places. Isaiah gets into that. Jesus, you could say, in Matthew 24 is speaking apocalyptically. It is a Jewish kind of tradition. And because we don't really deal with apocalypse, we're more straightforward folks, it can confuse us if we're not careful. So that's why we want to use the Bible to help us understand what's going on. So when you see something here, then we can go to another place and say, well, what does it mean here? If it's not explained where I'm at now, we can go to another place in the Bible, because the Bible doesn't play tricks. It has hyperlinks. Like we talking computer and internet stuff. You have a hyperlink. And what does a hyperlink do on a computer? Yeah, it takes you to another place that's related to the previous site. So the Bible is like that. Now, you can't touch it unless you've got one on your phone that has cross-references. It might do that very thing, actually have a hyperlink for your cross-references. But it does have these things that when you see something that it's going to invite you to take a look somewhere else, because the Bible is holistic. It's the most amazing book that has ever been written. The idea that this was simply a construct of human beings that some people like to put forth makes no sense whatsoever when you really look at the Bible. Over thousands of years, over 40 different men, all with the same message. I mean, think about some of our favorite novelists. If you read novels, some of our novelists, they have a hard time getting all of their loops closed, all of their ends tied by the end of the novel. Sometimes it seems like they forgot what even happened at the beginning of the novel, because you got a whole different story by the end of it. Well, that's because they're written by people, and people only. But you've got the Bible that's thousands of years that it takes to complete. People that are from different cultures, different times. I say different cultures. Most of them were Jewish. Luke was a Gentile, but most of them were Jewish. But even over time periods, we know how cultures shift and change to a degree here and there. There's always going to be that thread of commonality, but different times, different things, different backgrounds, shepherds, doctors, and yet all of it has one central theme. We could go on and on about that. I'm not going to take any more time with that idea, but it is an amazing book. And so when it's not going to trick you, it's holistic. So when it says bronze, so what is that about? So one commentator that I was talking about, it's got the mountains here. So there seems to be an opening. There's two mountains, and that would give us the idea of a valley. So his idea was maybe that was the entrance into God's throne. Well, I don't really see how that works, but maybe. But what we do know is if you go to Daniel chapter 2, remember in Daniel 2 you have the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And of course that statue, if you recall, is symbolic of the different kingdoms. Babylon was the first one, and then after Babylon would come the Persian Empire, the Persian kingdom. After the Persians would come the Greeks, and of course, after the Greeks come the Romans. And in the days of those kings, God would set up his kingdom, which was symbolic of a rock falling from heaven at the feet of the statue, and it grew into a great mountain, so on and so forth. But the first thing here that we see is bronze with the statue. I believe the lake. Let's go back to Daniel 2 before I get that confused. So he talks about bronze. And there's strength there. That's what we want that's what the Bible wants us to understand, is that there's strength, there's endurance when it comes to bronze. This is a double thing, because mountains also are going to represent strength. So let's go to Daniel 2 real quick. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, just a little bit of what Daniel's interpretation is of it. So in Daniel chapter 2, and we're going to start in verse... Let's start in verse 31. I just got new glasses. My wife told me I needed to get bifocals. I refused to do it, so I'm having a hard time here seeing. So we're going to start in verse 31. It says, "You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest, arms of silver, legs of iron, its feet partly iron and partly clay. And you looked, a stone was cast out, no human hand, and it was struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them into pieces. And the iron, the clay, and the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." So that's the dream. And he goes on and he talks about what all of those things meant. He talks about the different kingdoms. And when we talk about the bronze, he talks about the strength and endurance. So that's what bronze is going to represent. We also see that it can represent at least one other thing in the Bible. And you turn over to Leviticus, Exodus, and you have in the tabernacle and later on in the temple, you have the bronze altars, you have where they have the sacrifices. So that's all coming together, because sacrifice eventually, when you realize at the end of the day, a sacrifice is a judgment when it comes to those things. Not the sacrifices we make are not judgments, don't get me wrong here, but when you have the Old Testament, the old law, they had the moral law, and then they had the ritual law. Now, the moral law was, of course, the Ten Commandments, and you had about 613 commands altogether. But you have the 10 main commandments that were on the tablets. And so you were to keep those to the best of your ability. But could anybody keep the whole law? No. It wasn't possible to keep the whole law. And so if you broke one law, as the New Testament's going to remind us in a couple of different places, if you broke one law of the Old Testament, then you have just become a sinner. You've just broken the law. And you're guilty of the whole thing. Well, I didn't kill anybody. No, but you still broke the law. And when we sin, and of course, John tells us in 1 John that sin is lawlessness. Well, what law is he referring to here? He's not referring to the laws of the nations, although we are to keep the laws of the nations as long as they do not, the nation that we live in, as long as they don't violate the law of God. Once that takes place, then we must peacefully decline to keep the law of the nation because we are allegiant to God. But as we continue to look at these things and we see about what's going on with, I lost my train of thought, so I'm just mumbling until I pick it back up. Until we get to the point where we see how these things work together. How Daniel and how then we have the bronze there, and the bronze in the temple and the tabernacle. I think I found it. The sacrifices. What were they for? Well, if you can't keep the law, and nobody could, some of those sacrifices were meant because you have broken the law. Not all of them, but a good many of them were. And so here we are under the new covenant. We offer up our bodies as a living sacrifice, but that's because of Jesus. We don't have to go and worry about going to Jerusalem 3 times a year anymore, anything like that, because of what Jesus did. And his sacrifice on the cross, even though he was without sin, he was tempted in all ways like you and I are, the Bible says in Hebrews chapter 4, yet he was without sin. Other places talk about the sinless nature of Jesus. But he took our sin on himself. So even though he was sinless, that judgment, that sacrifice was a judgment from God. When those animals were sacrificed, it was because people weren't keeping the law. Now, the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin. Again, the author of Hebrews reminds us of that. Those things are done. Jesus' sacrifice was once for all. It's sad to hear when people think that when Jesus comes back that we're going to reinstitute the animal sacrifices. We're not. Why would we? Those things were pointing to the ultimate sacrifice that was in Christ on the cross. It was just for a little while. We live under a much better covenant, according to the author of Hebrews. So we don't need those things anymore, and we shouldn't look to try to reestablish them or to think that Jesus is going to reestablish them. He's not. There are people right now over in the Middle East that are preparing a sacrifice. For the first time in 2,000 years or so, they're preparing a sacrifice, thinking that that will bring in their Messiah. What a shame. The Messiah's already come. The sacrifices, if that takes place, and they have every plan to do it, if that takes place, it's not going to do anything but kill cows. That's it. It's not getting any further. I mean, it will probably lead to some serious conflict between a few different peoples, but spiritually speaking, it's not going to get anybody's sins taken care of. It can't. That's all with Jesus. But those were judgments. That's what I want us to think about. So when you have the bronze mountain means strength. Bronze also can mean endurance. It also leads us to understanding what's in the old law there with the altar. So there's judgment. Well, we see that happening. God is sending forth his spirits, his angels, and they're going to bring judgment upon. And what we see there in the north country is that the Spirit says, they have brought my spirit at rest. They've brought rest to my spirit, or at ease. So we're going to talk about that for a second, move on to the next section. The New American Standard Bible uses a little bit of interpretation there. It says that those who are going to the land of the north have appeased my wrath in the land of the north. So the English Standard Version, the King James, the American Standard Version, and the NIV have all said along the same lines, but differently from the New American Standard. And it says that the ones that have gone to the north country have set my spirit at rest, or quieted my spirit in the King James and the American Standard, or given my spirit rest. So I think the New American Standard is correct about that. I don't think there's anything wrong with its interpretation. The only problem that I have with this is that it was interpreted. It wasn't translated. And sometimes that does happen. People will make, translators will make interpretations rather than translations. And that's what happened there. If you go back, there's a tool that I like to use on my phone. It's called Literal Word. It's free, and it has the Bible in 4 different translations, English Standard, Legacy Standard, I think. It just popped that one on there the other day. King James and New American Standard, I think 1995. And it just has the text, and you can click, hold your thumb on it, or finger, whatever you want to use, and on any word, and it will bring up what word it was in the Hebrew or in the Greek, and how many times it was used, and in what contexts it was used, and it gives you links to see. It's a really good tool. So if you look at that, then you will see that it is literally translated as "set my spirit at peace," which again, interpreted probably does mean has appeased my wrath. Now, that's the end of that vision. We have about 5 minutes left, and I really do not want to get into a lot of what's going on with Joshua and the crowns. But I do want to say this before we dismiss. We've got about 5 minutes left. I just heard the bell. I do want to say this. So, in our Bibles, there are at least 2 Joshuas, right? You have Joshua that took over after Moses. You have Joshua who is the high priest. Now, I know Joshua's popped up several times throughout Zechariah, the high priest, that is. But if you turn to the New Testament, there's a Joshua as well. We don't call him Joshua because his name is in Greek, and so we've translated it from Greek. But if the New Testament was written in Hebrew or Aramaic, Jesus' name would be translated in English as Joshua. So that's an interesting parallel. And you can see, of course, the Bible does talk about, in the New Testament, specifically Hebrews, and a couple of different places as well, but specifically Hebrews, it talks about what shadows of the good things to come. And how Jesus is a fulfillment of all of those things. We call them types and antitypes. So in the Old Testament, you have the type of something that's a type of Christ. Well, it doesn't mean he's paralleled with Christ. No one can parallel Jesus. But it means it's pointing towards the ultimate, and that the ultimate person, the ultimate King of Kings, and that's Christ. And so here, as we're reading this in Zechariah chapter 6, verses 9 through 15, we see that Joshua is crowned. Now, in the Old Testament laws, who wore the crown primarily? The king. The high priest would wear what? A turban or a mitre, I think. Sometimes it's called a turban. Now, there was a thing around the turban. I guess it might be able to be called a crown. But there's an interesting thing going on here because the prophecy, as Zechariah is crowning Joshua, he's sitting on a throne. Well, who sits on a throne? Priests don't sit on a throne. Kings sit on a throne. Joshua's not being ordained as the king. Neither is Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is probably here, as most commentators believe. He's the administrator. In fact, one commentator believes that in verse 13, Zechariah is actually talking to Zerubbabel and Joshua. He goes back to chapter 4 with the vision, and there to say that is possible. I don't know. Zerubbabel was not mentioned in chapter 6, but certainly he's been an important role. Now, Zerubbabel was the administrator that does get the temple taken care of and rebuilt. Zerubbabel is a descendant of King David, and so this would have helped to give the Jewish people of that time some more messianic hope. You can imagine, they've been told for generations that the Messiah is coming. But then, I can't even imagine being taken off of your land and shipped somewhere else for 70 years. Not all of them got to go. Some of them stayed behind and lived in the city that had been completely destroyed by the Babylonians. It was a terrible time. They would have felt pretty down, I would say. We've had some low points in our lives, I'm sure, but that would be really low. Didn't have much confidence, but here Zechariah is telling them, God is telling them through Zechariah and the other prophets, post-exilic prophets, that I've not done with you. I haven't forgotten you. I haven't forgotten the promises they're going to be accomplished. And this would have been very encouraging to the people to see, the temple being rebuilt, to see Joshua here. And there's some other, there's some interpretations that people will get into when it comes to these two men working together. But at the very end, a person has to look at this and say, this is pointing to who? It's pointing to Jesus. Because Jesus is our high priest and our king. And he sits on the throne of David for all eternity, making intercession for us. I guess we're out of time at this point. I appreciate everyone's attention and speaking up. And if you have any questions or anything afterwards, please feel free to come up and we'll talk. I don't know that I have answers, but I'll be happy to discuss. Thank you all very much.